The dust devil danced across the barren landscape of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory, 1873. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered buildings that lined the main street, their wooden facades bleached pale by years of exposure. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of her mother's boarding house, watching the swirls of dirt chase tumbleweeds past the saloon, the general store, and the newly built train depot that promised prosperity but delivered only more hungry mouths to feed. She was 26 years old, though the weight of her circumstances made her feel ancient. Her reflection in the warped glass showed a woman still possessed of the beauty that had once made James Sullivan pursue her with such fervor. High cheekbones, eyes the color of prairie sage, and hair like spun wheat. But those eyes now held shadows that hadn't been there 5 years ago when she'd walked down the aisle of the tiny church at the edge of town, full of hope and dreams of children who would never come. "Margaret, stop your mooning and help me with these sheets." Her mother, Ruth Whitman, called from the back room. The older woman's voice carried the sharp edge it had acquired since her daughter had returned home 6 months ago, abandoned by a husband who needed sons to work his ranch and a wife who could provide them. Margaret turned from the window, her calico dress rustling against the floorboards that creaked with every step. The boarding house was modest 6 rooms above, a dining area and kitchen below. But it was respectable work, better than what some abandoned wives were forced to endure. She'd seen them in the saloons, their painted faces hiding desperation, and thanked God her mother had taken her back despite the shame. "Coming, Mama," she replied, moving to help strip the beds in room 3. A traveling merchant had left that morning, heading east on the train, leaving behind only the lingering scent of tobacco and pomade. As they worked, Ruth spoke without looking at her daughter. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by earlier. Said her nephew from Chicago is coming to visit. A banker, she says, widowed last year from consumption." Margaret's hand stilled on the pillowcase. "Mama, please!" "You can't live here forever. Girl, you're young yet. Just because James Sullivan was fool enough to throw away a barren woman," Margaret finished bitterly. "That's what I am. Mama, Doctor, Morrison said so himself after 3 years of trying. No man wants a wife who can't give him children." Ruth's weathered face softened slightly. "Doctor, Morrison has been wrong before. Remember when he said old Sam's lung fever would kill him? Sam's still spitting tobacco juice on the sidewalk every morning." Despite her mood, Margaret almost smiled, but the moment passed quickly as the weight of her reality settled back on her shoulders. In a territory where large families meant survival, where sons were needed to work the land and daughters to help with the endless chores, a childless woman was seen as cursed. The other women at church still whispered when she passed, their fertility worn like badges of honor in their swollen bellies, and the children clinging to their skirts. The afternoon wore on with a routine of laundry and cooking. The boarding house currently had 4 occupants: Mr. Elias Grant, a surveyor for the railroad; the widow Patterson, who'd lived there for 2 years; young Tommy Morrison, who worked at the telegraph office; and a mysterious man who'd arrived yesterday, keeping to his room and requesting meals be left outside his door. As evening approached, Margaret found herself in the kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. The repetitive motion usually calmed her, but tonight she felt restless. Through the kitchen window, she could see the saloon across the street coming alive with lamplight and laughter. The tinny sound of a piano drifted on the air, mixing with the lowing of cattle from the stockyards at the edge of town. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the kitchen door open until rough hands grabbed her arms. Well, what have we here? The Baron Sullivan woman, all alone." Margaret's heart leaped to her throat as she recognized Jake Coleman's voice. He was the son of the town's largest cattle rancher, a young man who'd grown up believing his father's money entitled him to anything he wanted. The smell of whiskey on his breath was overwhelming. "Let go of me," she said firmly, trying to pull away. "Come now, Maggie, no need to be unfriendly." His grip tightened, and she could see his companions, 3 other young men from town, laughing in the doorway. "We were just having a discussion at the saloon about you. Ben here bet that you were cursed. That's why you couldn't give poor James any babies. But I said maybe you just hadn't been with a real man." Fear and anger warred in Margaret's chest. "Get out of my mother's house before I scream." "Your mama's at the church meeting. Won't be back for an hour." One of the others said, "We saw her leave." Jake's face came closer, his features handsome in that cruel way that some women found appealing until they learned what lay beneath. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be nice to us, or the whole town's going to hear about how you invited us in. Who do you think they'll believe, the respectable Coleman boys or a cast-off wife?" Margaret's mind raced. She could scream, but the boarding house was at the quiet end of the street. By the time anyone came to investigate, these men could spin any story they wanted. Her reputation, already fragile, would be completely destroyed. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "Just leave. I won't tell anyone you were here." Jake laughed, the sound ugly in the warm kitchen. "Boys, I think we should teach Mrs. Sullivan some hospitality. But first," he looked around at his companions with a grin that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Tom, didn't you say that new fellow who came in on yesterday's stage is staying upstairs, the one who outdrew Charlie Maddox at cards?" Tom nodded eagerly. "Room 6, dead drunk when I saw him carried up there. Probably still sleeping it off." Jake's grin widened. "Well then, I think we've just solved our problem. Can't have the lady's reputation ruined, can we? But if she were found in a stranger's bed, well, that would be her doing, wouldn't it?" Before Margaret could process what was happening, rough hands were dragging her toward the stairs. She struggled, her nails raking across someone's face, earning her a slap that made her ears ring. They half carried, half dragged her up the narrow staircase, their laughter echoing off the walls. "This is perfect," Jake said as they reached the door to room 6. A joke for the ages. The barren woman so desperate she threw herself at a drunken stranger. They pushed open the unlocked door, revealing a dim room where a figure lay motionless on the bed. In the fading light from the window, Margaret could make out a tall form, fully clothed except for his boots, a black hat covering his face. "Sweet dreams, Mrs. Sullivan." Jake sneered as they shoved her into the room. She stumbled, falling against the bed as the door slammed shut behind her. She heard the key turn in the lock. They must have taken the master key from the hook in the kitchen. "Let me out!" She pounded on the door, but their laughter was already fading down the stairs. Through the thin walls, she heard the kitchen door bang shut, then silence except for her own ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. Margaret stood frozen in the darkness, her mind reeling from what had just happened. Slowly, she became aware of her surroundings, the simple furnishings, the smell of leather and trail dust, and the steady breathing of the man on the bed who hadn't stirred despite the commotion. What was she going to do if she was found here? Her reputation would be utterly destroyed, but she was locked in, and the window was a 20-foot drop to the ground. She could wake the stranger, but what would a drunk cowboy do when he found a woman in his room? Her throat constricted with fear. As if sensing her distress, the figure on the bed stirred slightly, a low groan escaping from beneath the hat. Margaret pressed herself against the door, praying he would simply roll over and continue sleeping. She would wait until her mother returned, then call for help. Surely Ruth would believe her story, even if no one else did. The room grew darker as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that she couldn't appreciate through her terror. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing her own desperation. The sounds of the town's evening activities drifted up, horses whinnying, men calling to each other, the saloon's piano starting up again with a jaunty tune that seemed to mock her plight. Margaret slid down to sit on the floor, her back against the door, arms wrapped around her knees. Hot tears traced paths down her cheeks as she thought of how far she had fallen. Once, she had been James Sullivan's beloved bride, the envy of other young women in town. Now she was a joke, literally thrown to a stranger's bed by cruel young men who saw her as nothing more than an object for their amusement. "A joke sent her to the cowboy's bed," she whispered bitterly to herself, the words that would haunt her for months to come. In the darkness of that room, with only the unconscious stranger for company, Margaret Sullivan faced the cruel reality of her position in this unforgiving land, where a woman's worth was measured by her womb and her reputation was as fragile as prairie grass in a drought. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and fear, while the town of Cedar Ridge continued its rough existence, unaware or uncaring of the drama playing out in room 6 of the Whitman boarding house. And on the bed, the stranger slept on, oblivious to the role he was about to play in changing Margaret Sullivan's life forever. The first rays of dawn crept through the window, painting golden stripes across the rough wooden floor. Margaret stirred from her cramped position against the door, her neck stiff and her dress wrinkled beyond repair. She had dozed fitfully through the night, jerking awake at every sound, terrified that the stranger would wake and discover her presence, but he had remained motionless, save for the occasional shift and mumble. Now, in the growing light, she could see him more clearly. The black hat had slipped from his face during the night, revealing features weathered by sun and wind. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble covering a strong jaw. His clothes, though dusty, were of good quality, not the rough homespun of a typical drifter, but the well-made garments of a man who had some means. As she watched, his eyes opened suddenly, the clearest blue she'd ever seen, like the sky after a storm. For a moment, they stared at each other in mutual shock. Then he sat up quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward where a gun belt would typically rest. "Ma'am." His voice was rough with sleep and the aftermath of drink, but not unkind. "What? How did you—" Margaret scrambled to her feet, her face burning with humiliation. "Please, sir, I can explain. I was forced." He held up a hand, wincing as the movement apparently aggravated what must be a considerable headache. "Slow down. Start from the beginning." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "And perhaps you could tell me your name." "Margaret Sullivan," she whispered, then louder. "Margaret Sullivan. My mother owns this boarding house. Last night, some men, they locked me in here as a cruel joke." She watched his face carefully as she told the story, seeing his expression darken when she mentioned Jake Coleman's name. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window, looking out at the awakening town. "Coleman," he said finally. "Big ranch north of town. Son thinks he owns everything he sees. You know him." He turned back to her, and she was struck again by those remarkable eyes. "We've had encounters. My name's Luke Prescott. I'm sorry you were subjected to such treatment, Mrs. Sullivan." The formal address made her flinch. "It's Miss Sullivan now. My husband, we're no longer married." Understanding flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been sympathy. He moved to the door, trying the handle and confirming what they both knew, it was still locked. "Your mother will be looking for you soon." "She should be starting breakfast preparations. She'll notice I'm missing." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how this must look, a divorced woman spending the night in a strange man's room. "Mr. Prescott, when they find us like this, they'll think exactly what those boys wanted them to think," he finished grimly. He ran a hand through his hair, then moved to his saddlebags in the corner. "But I won't let your reputation suffer on my account." "What can you do? The damage is done. Once that door opens and people see us together." He pulled out a clean shirt and turned his back to her while he changed, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. "I can offer you the protection of my name, if temporarily. Tell them we were married last night. A whirlwind courtship, perhaps impulsive, but legitimate. Margaret stared at him in shock. Lie about being married? That's impossible. Everyone knows me here. They know I'm not married. Then tell them the truth about how you came to be here and let me vouch for your honor. I may be a stranger, but I'm not without influence. He turned back to face her, now in a fresh white shirt. Or we can try the window. It's a fair drop, but there's a hay wagon below. You could slip away before anyone sees you. She moved to look out the window. Seeing he was right about the wagon, but the thought of sneaking away like a thief, of giving Jake Coleman the satisfaction of her shame, made her stomach turn. Why would you help me? She asked softly. You don't know me. Luke was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Let's say I have a particular dislike for men who abuse their power over women, and Jake Coleman has been needing a lesson in manners for some time. Before Margaret could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Her mother's voice called out, Margaret, Margaret, where are you? Girl! Panic seized her. In moments, her mother would try the door, find it locked, and demand entry. The truth would come out, and with it, the final destruction of her reputation. Luke moved quickly, catching her arm gently. Trust me, he said, then called out in a clear voice. Mrs. Whitman, your daughter is safe. We had a bit of situation last night, but no harm has come to her. The footsteps stopped. Who is that? What's going on, Margaret? I'm here, Mama, Margaret called, her voice shaky. I'm all right. Open this door immediately. Luke looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he continued. Ma'am, the door was locked from the outside. Some local boys thought it would be amusing to lock your daughter in here after she came to check on a disturbance. I give you my word as a gentleman that nothing improper has occurred. There was a long pause. Then the sound of keys jangling. The door swung open to reveal Ruth Whitman, her face a mask of concern and suspicion. Behind her, Margaret could see other boarders gathering, including the gossipy widow Patterson. Ruth's eyes took in the scene her daughter, disheveled but fully clothed, and the stranger, respectable-looking despite the circumstances. Margaret, what is the meaning of this? Before Margaret could speak, Luke stepped forward. Mrs. Whitman, I'm Luke Prescott. I apologize for the disturbance. Your daughter was checking on what she thought might be an intruder last night when some young men, I believe the Coleman boy was among them, forced her into my room and locked the door as a prank. She spent an uncomfortable night by the door while I was indisposed from yesterday's travels. Ruth's sharp eyes moved between them, clearly trying to assess the truth of the situation. And you expect me to believe my daughter spent the night in a man's room and nothing happened? Mama, please, Margaret began, but Luke held up a hand. I expect you to believe that your daughter is a lady of impeccable character who was the victim of a cruel joke. I'm prepared to call on Jake Coleman and his friends to demand an explanation for their behavior. The widow Patterson sniffed from the doorway. Likely story. Everyone knows what kind of woman. Finish that sentence, Luke said quietly, his tone suddenly dangerous. And you'll answer to me for it. The widow fell silent, but her expression remained skeptical. Margaret could feel the weight of judgment settling over her like a shroud. Even with Luke's defense, the story would spread. By noon, everyone in Cedar Ridge would know she'd spent the night in a stranger's room. Mr. Prescott, Ruth said finally, I appreciate your discretion. Margaret, go to your room and clean yourself up. We'll discuss this later. Margaret moved toward the door, but Luke's voice stopped her. Mrs. Sullivan, might I have a word with you later in a proper setting, with your mother present? Of course. She turned back, confused by the formality in his tone and the meaningful look in his eyes. Yes, of course. As she passed the gathered boarders, She heard the whispers starting already. The widow's voice, deliberately loud enough to carry "no smoke without fire, I always say," in her small room under the eaves. Margaret sank onto her narrow bed and buried her face in her hands. The morning that should have brought relief had only brought new complications. Luke Prescott had defended her honor. But at what cost, and why did he want to speak with her again? She rose and poured water from the pitcher into the basin, catching sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand. Her hair was a mess, her face pale with dark circles under her eyes. She looked exactly like what the gossips would say a desperate woman who'd thrown herself at the first available man. As she washed and changed into a clean dress, she could hear the breakfast preparations beginning below. Life in the boarding house would go on, but her place in it had shifted. She was no longer just the divorced daughter helping her mother. She was now the woman who'd spent the night with the mysterious stranger. Through her window, she could see Jake Coleman and his friends lounging outside the saloon, laughing and congratulating themselves on their prank. Anger flared in her chest. They would face no consequences for their actions, while she would bear the shame. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret," her mother's voice was gentler now. "That Mr. Prescott is asking to speak with us. He's waiting in the parlor." Margaret smoothed her hair one more time and followed her mother downstairs. Luke was standing by the window, his profile stern as he watched Jake Coleman across the street. He'd cleaned up considerably shaved, hair combed, wearing a black coat that emphasized his broad shoulders. "Ladies," he said, turning as they entered. "Thank you for seeing me." Ruth gestured to the settee, taking a chair opposite. Margaret sat carefully, acutely aware of Luke's presence beside her. "Mr. Prescott," Ruth began, "while I appreciate your defense of my daughter, you must understand our position. This incident, regardless of its innocent nature, has compromised Margaret's reputation." "I understand completely," Luke replied, "which is why I have a proposition. But first, I should properly introduce myself. I'm not just a drifting cowboy. I own a ranch about 40 miles north of here, the Triple Bar. I came to town on business and had the misfortune of celebrating a successful cattle sale too enthusiastically." Margaret looked at him in surprise. A ranch owner was a man of substance, not the saddle tramp she'd assumed him to be. "I find myself in need of help," he continued. "My housekeeper recently left to care for her ailing sister, and I've been managing poorly on my own. I propose to hire Mrs. Sullivan as a housekeeper, with proper wages and accommodations. It would remove her from the current unpleasantness and provide her with respectable employment." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Just a housekeeper?" "I give you my word, though I should mention that several other ranch families live nearby. She wouldn't be isolated." Margaret found her voice. "Mr. Prescott, that's kind, but I can't simply leave. My mother needs me here." "Actually," Ruth said slowly, "it might not be a bad idea. Let the gossip die down. In a few months, when you return, this will be old news." Margaret stared at her mother in betrayal. "You want me to leave?" "I want what's best for you, and right now, that might be distance from Jake Coleman and his ilk." Luke stood. "Take time to think about it. I'll be in town for 2 more days, but I should mention I intend to have a conversation with young Coleman before I leave. Some lessons need to be taught." After he left, Margaret turned to her mother. "How can you suggest I go off with a stranger?" Ruth's weathered face was sad, but determined. "Because I've made inquiries. Luke Prescott is known as an honest man. And because I see how the women look at you at church. How the men whisper, 'This town has become poison for you. Daughter, perhaps it's time for a fresh start.'" Margaret moved to the window, watching Luke's tall figure stride purposefully toward the saloon where Jake Coleman still lounged. Whatever happened next, she knew her life in Cedar Ridge would never be the same. The question was whether she had the courage to leave it behind entirely. trading the familiar poison for the unknown possibilities that waited 40 miles north at a ranch called the Triple Bar. The morning sickness came like a thief in the dawn. 3 months after Margaret had settled into her new life at the Triple Bar Ranch, she knelt beside her bed, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other gripping the washstand as her body rebelled against the hardtack biscuits she'd eaten before rising. When the spasms passed, she sat back on her heels, a cold dread settling over her as she counted the weeks since her last monthly courses. It couldn't be. She was barren, doctor. Morrison had been very clear about that after examining her during her marriage to James. 3 years of trying, of desperate prayers and bitter herbs recommended by well-meaning women, had produced nothing. The diagnosis had been final. Her womb was inhospitable to seed. Yet, as she placed a trembling hand over her still flat stomach, she knew with a certainty that defied medical opinion. The fatigue that had plagued her for weeks, the tenderness in her breasts, the way certain smells now turned her stomach, all signs she'd witnessed in other women but never experienced herself. Margaret rose unsteadily and moved to the small mirror above her dresser. Her reflection showed a woman transformed by 3 months of hard work and prairie air. The Triple Bar had been good to her. Luke had kept his word. She was the housekeeper. Nothing more. With her own small cabin behind the main house, the work was demanding but honest, and the other ranch families had accepted her without the judgment she'd faced in Cedar Ridge. But this changed everything. She dressed carefully in her brown work dress and pinned up her hair with shaking fingers. The main house would need breakfast started soon. Luke and his ranch hands rose with the sun, expecting hot coffee and a hearty meal before beginning their day's work. She had established a comfortable routine, one that would be shattered by what grew within her. The walk to the main house had never seemed longer. September had brought cooler mornings to Wyoming, and she pulled her shawl tighter as she crossed the yard. The ranch sprawled before her in the early light, the barn and corrals, the bunkhouse where the hands slept, the vast pastures dotted with cattle. Luke had built something substantial here, carved from wild land through sheer determination. In the kitchen, she mechanically began her preparations. Coffee first strong and black, the way the men liked it. Then bacon, eggs, biscuits. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced. She would have to leave. There was no other choice. Luke had been nothing but gentlemanly these 3 months, but he couldn't harbor a woman carrying another man's child. The scandal would ruin him. Morning, Margaret. She startled, nearly dropping the coffee pot. Luke stood in the doorway, earlier than usual, his hair still damp from washing. He studied her with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "You're up early," she managed, turning back to the stove. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check the ledgers before breakfast." He moved into the kitchen, and she was acutely aware of his presence. "You feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine." The lie came automatically. She'd become accomplished at lies these past months, pretending she didn't notice the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, pretending her heart didn't race when he smiled, pretending she was content with their careful, proper distance. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "Sam's wife mentioned you didn't come to the quilting bee yesterday." Margaret busied herself with the bacon. "I had mending to finish. Mary also said you haven't been to town for supplies in 2 weeks. That's not like you." She knew what he wasn't saying. Her self-imposed isolation had been noticed. But how could she go to town when the very sight of other women's children made her touch her own stomach in wonder and fear? "I'll go tomorrow," she said quietly. Luke set down his cup and moved closer. "Margaret, if something's troubling you..." "Nothing's troubling me." She stepped away. The familiar dance they'd perfected over 3 months. Always circling, never touching. The very air between them charged with unspoken words. The rest of the hands arrived for breakfast, saving her from further questions. She served the meal and retreated to the kitchen, listening to their easy banter about the day's work. Tom Fletcher, the young hand, was teasing old Pete about his fear of the new bull they'd acquired. Luke's foreman, Robert Hayes, was organizing the crew for fence repairs on the north pasture. Normal ranch life, into which she'd settled so naturally, until now. After the men left, Margaret cleaned the kitchen methodically, delaying the moment when she'd have to face her changed reality. But as she scrubbed the last pot, a wave of dizziness forced her to grip the sink's edge. "That's enough pretending, I think." She spun to find Luke standing in the doorway again, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you mean. Don't you—" He stepped into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. "You've been sick in the mornings. You can't stand the smell of certain foods. You're exhausted by afternoon." His jaw tightened. "I may be a bachelor, but I've been around ranch life long enough to recognize the signs." Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair. There was no point in denying it. "How long have you known?" "I suspected 2 weeks ago. This morning confirmed it." He pulled out another chair and sat across from her. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" She looked at him in confusion. "What I want doesn't matter. I'll leave, of course. Today, if you prefer. I'm sorry for the trouble." "Stop." His voice was firm. "I'm not sending you away." "But you don't understand. This child, it's not, that night in Cedar Ridge." "I understand perfectly." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "You're carrying my child, Margaret." The world seemed to tilt. "That's impossible. One night, and I'm barren," the doctor said. "Doctors can be wrong." A small smile played at his lips. "Though I admit, it's somewhat ironic. One drunken night I barely remember, born from a cruel joke. And here we are." Margaret pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. "You must think that I planned." "I think nothing of the sort." He reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers before she pulled back. "I think Jake Coleman's prank had consequences none of us could have foreseen. The whole territory will know. They'll count the months. They'll whisper." "Let them whisper." His voice turned hard. "I've faced worse than gossip." Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the ranch hands were heading to the north pasture, tiny figures against the vast landscape. "You don't understand. All my life, I've been the barren woman. James left me because of it. The women in town pitied me or scorned me. And now, when I'm unmarried, living in a bachelor's house, now I conceive they'll call me a—" "Don't!" Luke was behind her suddenly, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but still not touching. "Don't let their poison into your mind." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "What am I supposed to do? I can't go back to Cedar Ridge. I can't stay here and ruin your reputation. I have nowhere to go." "You could marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me." He said it simply, as if suggesting she try a new recipe. "It solves everything. The child has a name, you have protection, and the gossips have nothing to feast on." "You can't be serious. Marriage is—" "It's not something you do to solve a problem." "Isn't it?" His expression was unreadable. "Most marriages out here are practical arrangements. We work well together. You're the best housekeeper I've had, and the men respect you. It makes sense." Margaret felt something inside her break. A practical arrangement, of course. How foolish of me to think. She stopped herself, turning away. "Think what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." She wiped her tears angrily. "I won't trap you into marriage. Luke, what happened that night wasn't your fault. You were drunk. I was locked in there against my will. Neither of us chose it." "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But we can choose what happens next." She moved to the door, needing distance from him, from the temptation of his offer. "I need time to think." "Margaret." But she was already gone, hurrying across the yard to her cabin. Inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. A child. After all the years of emptiness, of feeling like a failure as a woman, life grew within her. The irony was almost too much to bear that it had taken one night with a stranger to accomplish what 3 years of marriage couldn't. Through her window, she could see Luke exit the main house and head toward the barn. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was a good man, offering to sacrifice his freedom for her honor. But she'd been in one marriage of necessity, knew the slow poison of living with someone who felt obligated to you. As the morning wore on, Margaret tried to imagine her choices. She could leave, try to find work in another town where her story wasn't known. But a pregnant woman alone had few options, and none of them good. She could return to her mother in Cedar Ridge and face the shame, raise her child as a bastard in a town that already despised her. Or she could accept Luke's offer and spend her life wondering if he resented the trap that Jake Coleman's cruel joke had sprung on them both. Her hand pressed against her still flat stomach. She made a promise to the life growing there. "I'll find a way to keep you safe, little one, whatever it costs me. You won't suffer for the circumstances of your conception." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, matching the turmoil in her heart. The Triple Bar Ranch had been her refuge, but now it felt like another cage, one built of obligation and propriety rather than love. She thought of Luke's eyes that morning, the way they'd softened when he spoke of the child. Was it possible he felt more than duty? Or was she fooling herself again, as she had with James? Seeing affection where only responsibility existed, the first drops of rain began to fall, and Margaret watched them trace patterns on her window. Somewhere out there, Luke was working with his men, building his ranch, creating his legacy. A legacy that might now include a child he'd never planned for, with a woman he'd never chosen. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and with it came the certainty that her time of hiding was over. Tomorrow, she would have to give Luke her answer. Tonight, she would pray for wisdom to choose not just what was safe or proper, but what was right for her child, for Luke, and for herself. The October wind howled across the prairie like a living thing, rattling the windows of the main house where Margaret stood folding linens. 2 weeks had passed since Luke's proposal, 2 weeks of careful distance and unspoken words. She hadn't given him an answer, and he hadn't pressed. But the question hung between them like a spider's web, invisible yet impossible to ignore. "Riders coming in." Tom Fletcher's shout from the yard made Margaret look up. Through the window, she saw a group of men approaching, their horses kicking up dust despite the recent rains. Her heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Jake Coleman, flanked by 3 of his father's ranch hands. Luke emerged from the barn, his foreman Robert close behind. Several of the Triple Bar hands drifted closer. Sensing trouble, Margaret watched Luke's stance change, becoming loose and ready, like a mountain cat preparing to spring. She couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she saw Jake's mocking gesture, the way he pointed toward the house toward her. Luke's response was swift. He grabbed Jake from his saddle, pulling him to the ground with a force that sent dust flying. "No," Margaret whispered, rushing for the door. By the time she reached the porch, a full brawl had erupted in the yard. Luke had Jake pinned, his fist connecting with the younger man's jaw, while Robert and the other hands kept Jake's companions at bay. "Enough," she called out, but her voice was lost in the shouting. It was old Pete who ended it, firing his shotgun into the air. The fighting ceased, men stepping back, breathing hard. Jake struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his nose, his fine clothes covered in dirt. "You'll pay for this, Prescott," he spat. "My father—" "Your father can go to hell," Luke said coldly. "And so can you. Get off my land." Jake's eyes found Margaret on the porch, and his bloodied face twisted into an ugly smile. "Protecting your whore. Prescott, how noble. though I hear she's not so barren after all. Miraculous how that happens when a woman spreads her. Luke's fist cut off the rest. This time, Jake stayed down, groaning in the dirt. His companions helped him onto his horse, and they rode off. Jake slumped over his saddle horn. Margaret stood frozen as Luke turned toward her. His knuckles were bloody, his shirt torn, but his eyes held something she'd never seen before, a wild, protective fury that took her breath away. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "We're going to town." "Luke, to see the minister. We're getting married today." The other men dispersed quickly, suddenly very interested in their work. Margaret found herself alone with Luke as he climbed the porch steps. "You can't simply decide." "Yes, I can." He was close now, close enough that she could see the small cut above his eye. "Coleman won't let this go. He'll spread his poison, and his father has influence. The only protection I can offer you is my name. I haven't agreed to marry you." "Then agree now." His voice softened. "Margaret, please, let me do this." She studied his face, searching for the truth behind his urgency. "Is it just duty, Luke? Just protecting my reputation?" He was quiet for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek with surprising gentleness. "Would it matter if I said it was more?" Her breath caught. "Yes." "Then it's more." He dropped his hand, stepping back. "Now pack. The minister leaves for Denver tomorrow, and I want this done today." An hour later, they were in Luke's wagon, heading for Cedar Ridge. Margaret had changed into her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes and tried to tame her wind-blown hair. Luke had cleaned up as well, though his knuckles were still raw and a bruise was forming on his jaw. The 20-mile journey passed largely in silence, broken only by Luke pointing out landmarks or commenting on the weather. Margaret's mind raced with the magnitude of what they were about to do. Another marriage, this time to a man she'd known mere months. A marriage born from scandal and necessity rather than courtship and choice. As they neared town, Luke finally spoke of something beyond pleasantries. "There are things you should know about me before we do this." Margaret turned to him. "What things?" "I wasn't always a rancher. Before I came to Wyoming, I worked for the Army, scouting, mostly, during the Indian campaigns." His hands tightened on the reins. "I did things I'm not proud of, saw things that still visit me at night. We all have pasts, Luke. Not like mine." He glanced at her. "I'm not an easy man. Margaret, I have moods, dark times when I need to be alone. I'm telling you this now so you can change your mind if you want." She thought of her own dark times, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep in an empty bed, feeling like a failure as a woman. "I won't change my mind." They reached Cedar Ridge as the sun touched the western horizon. The town looked exactly as Margaret remembered, dusty, rough, filled with people trying to carve civilization from wilderness. But she was different now, no longer the broken woman who'd fled in shame. The church sat at the end of Main Street, its white steeple a beacon of respectability in the rough town. Reverend Douglas was preparing for evening prayers when they arrived. "Mr. Prescott, Mrs. Sullivan." His surprise was evident. "What brings you to town?" "We need you to perform a marriage, Reverend, today." The minister's eyebrows rose. "Today, but the banns haven't been read. There's been no announcement." Luke pulled out a roll of bills. "I'll make a substantial donation to the church building fund." Reverend Douglas looked between them, his eyes lingering on Margaret with barely concealed curiosity. She could see him making calculations, drawing conclusions, but the money won out over propriety. "Very well. Let me fetch my wife and daughter as witnesses." As they waited in the small sanctuary, Margaret felt Luke's hand brush hers. "Last chance to run," he said quietly. "I'm not running anymore." The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Margaret heard herself speak the familiar vows to love, honor, and obey words that had proved hollow once before. But when Luke slipped a simple gold band on her finger produced from his pocket, making her wonder how long he'd carried it. Something in his eyes made her believe that perhaps this time would be different. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Douglas intoned. "You may kiss your bride." Luke's kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he was afraid she might break. Margaret found herself leaning into it, seeking something deeper, but he pulled back, aware of their audience. They signed the register. Luke's bold signature next to her more delicate one, Margaret Prescott. The name felt foreign on her tongue when she thanked the minister's wife. Outside, night had fallen. As they walked to the wagon, Margaret saw familiar faces peering from windows, no doubt spreading the news already. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the Baron Sullivan woman had married the rancher who defended her honor. "Are you hungry?" Luke asked. "We could stay at your mother's tonight, head back in the morning." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "I mean, I'd rather go home, to the ranch." He studied her face in the lamplight. "It's a long drive in the dark." "I don't care. Please, Luke. I can't face them all tonight. The questions, the looks." He helped her into the wagon without another word. As they left town, Margaret allowed herself one glance back. Somewhere in that cluster of buildings, her mother was probably just learning of her daughter's sudden marriage. There would be hurt feelings to mend, explanations to give, but not tonight. The journey back was even quieter than the trip out. The moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie into a silver sea. Margaret found herself stealing glances at her new husband, this man she'd bound herself to, in the moonlight. His profile was all sharp angles and shadows. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did today, with Jake, I mean." Luke's laugh was humorless. "I've wanted to do that for a long time. He just gave me a reason." Will there be trouble with his father? Probably. But Coleman's not the only one with influence. I've sold cattle to army posts from here to Montana. I have friends too. They were perhaps 5 miles from the ranch when Luke suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Alarmed, he pointed ahead. In the distance, an orange glow lit the sky. "Fire!" Margaret's blood ran cold. "The ranch—" Luke was already urging the horses to greater speed. The wagon bounced and rattled over the rough trail, Margaret gripping the seat to keep from being thrown. As they drew closer, her worst fears were confirmed. Flames engulfed one of the barns, and men ran back and forth with buckets, fighting desperately to keep it from spreading. "Coleman," Luke growled. Pulling the wagon to a halt near the main house, he jumped down and ran toward the fire, shouting orders. Margaret followed more slowly, her hand protective over her stomach. Mary Hayes, the foreman's wife, appeared at her elbow. "Thank God you're back. It started an hour ago. We think someone set it deliberately. Tom found oil-soaked rags." Margaret watched Luke organizing the bucket brigade, his wedding clothes already black with soot. This was her life now, violence and retribution. The constant struggle against both nature and men. But as she saw Luke risk himself to save a trapped horse, she felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. Coleman had struck at them, but he hadn't won, not yet. "What can I do to help?" she asked Mary. The older woman smiled grimly. "Get water heating for burns and injuries. It's going to be a long night. Mrs. Prescott." "Mrs. Prescott." Margaret squared her shoulders and headed for the kitchen. She was a married woman again, tied to a man and a ranch that were under siege. But this time, she wouldn't be a passive victim. This time, she would fight alongside her husband for their home and their future. The fire raged on, but Margaret worked with steady hands, preparing supplies for the firefighters. Through the kitchen window, she could see Luke, tireless in his efforts, commanding respect from every man there. He was no longer the drunk cowboy she'd been locked in with that fateful night. He was a leader, a protector, a man worth standing beside. As dawn broke over the triple bar, the fire was finally contained. The barn was lost, but the other buildings stood safe. Luke stumbled into the kitchen, exhausted and filthy, to find Margaret still working, bandaging Tom Fletcher's burned hands. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were married now, bound by law and circumstance, but perhaps, Margaret thought as she saw the warmth in Luke's tired eyes, they might someday be bound by something more. The winter of 1874 arrived early and harsh, blanketing the Triple Bar Ranch in snow by November. Margaret's pregnancy advanced with the changing seasons, her body swelling with life even as the land lay dormant under ice. She moved more slowly now, her hand often pressed to her lower back, but she refused to abandon her duties entirely. "You should be resting," Luke said for the 100th time, finding her kneading bread in the kitchen despite the early hour. Frost painted the windows white, and the fire in the stove fought valiantly against the cold seeping through the walls. "Idle hands make for worried minds," Margaret replied, not looking at him. In the 2 months since their hasty marriage, they'd developed a careful dance, polite, considerate, but maintaining a distance that their wedding vows should have bridged. Luke poured himself coffee, a morning ritual that had become fraught with unspoken tension. They lived as man and wife in name only. He still slept in the main bedroom while she kept her small cabin, though he'd offered repeatedly to switch arrangements. "Robert says we lost 2 more cattle to the cold last night," he said, staring out at the frozen landscape. "If this winter keeps up like this..." Margaret heard what he didn't say. The barn fire had cost them dearly, not just the structure, but the hay stored inside. They'd scrambled to buy more, but prices were high and quality low. The cattle were suffering. "We'll manage," she said firmly. "We always do." Luke turned to study her, and she felt the familiar flutter in her chest that his direct gaze always caused. "You say 'we' now. Should I not? I am your wife." "Are you?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Before Margaret could respond, Tom Fletcher burst through the door, bringing a swirl of snow and panic. "Boss, riders coming. Looks like Coleman and maybe a dozen men." Luke's face hardened. He strapped on his gun belt with practiced ease. "Get Robert and the others. Have them take positions but keep their rifles hidden unless needed." "Luke," Margaret started, but he was already heading for the door. "Stay inside. No matter what happens, stay inside." She watched through the window as Jake Coleman and his men rode into the yard. Jake's face still bore marks from their last encounter, and his expression promised violence. Luke stood alone on the porch, seemingly relaxed, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. Words were exchanged, too low for her to hear. Then Jake gestured broadly, and she caught fragments. "My father's offer. Last chance. Leave the territory." Luke's response was clear in his posture: rejection, defiance. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, and Margaret's heart stopped. But Luke was faster, his weapon drawn and aimed before Jake could clear leather. "I'd think carefully about your next move, Coleman," Luke's voice carried now. "Your father might own half the territory, but bullets don't care about land deeds." "You can't fight us all, Prescott." "He doesn't have to." Robert Hayes emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. Other triple bar hands appeared from strategic positions, all armed, all ready. The standoff stretched taut as winter wind. Margaret pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby move life, asserting itself in the face of potential death. Finally, Jake holstered his weapon. "This isn't over. My father..." "Your father can make his offers in person if he's got the stones." Luke interrupted. "Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." The Coleman men retreated, but their dust had barely settled before Luke was organizing defenses. "Double the night watch," he ordered Robert, "and send word to Fort Laramie. I have friends there who should know Coleman's getting bold." That evening, the ranch felt like an armed camp. Margaret served dinner to grim-faced men who kept their rifles close. The easy camaraderie of summer had given way to siege mentality. Later, as she cleaned the kitchen, Luke appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk." She dried her hands slowly, dreading what was coming. "If you're going to suggest I leave for my safety." "I'm going to suggest you move into the main house. Tonight." His tone brooked no argument. "If Coleman's men come in the night, I need you where I can protect you." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "People will talk." "People already talk. You're my wife, carrying my child. It's time we stopped pretending otherwise." The words stung more than she expected. "Is that what we're doing, pretending?" Luke crossed the room in 2 strides, backing her against the counter. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and her traitorous body leaned toward him. But he stopped just short, his hands braced on either side of her. "What would you have me do? Margaret, you accept my name but keep me at arm's length. You wear my ring but won't share my home. Tell me what you want." "I don't know." The admission burst from her. "I don't know what I want. I'm grateful for your protection, but you don't love me." His voice was flat. "You married me for the child's sake, just as I offered for honor's sake." Margaret looked up at him, seeing pain in those blue eyes that usually showed nothing. "Is that what you think? What else should I think? You've made it clear this is a business arrangement." "Because I'm afraid." The words hung between them like struck bells. "I'm afraid of wanting more than you're willing to give." "I've been the unwanted wife before." "Luke, I can't." Her words were cut off by his kiss, fierce and demanding, nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. Margaret's hands fisted in his shirt, holding on as the world tilted. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Does that feel like duty to you?" Luke asked roughly. "I've wanted to do that every damn day since you arrived here, maybe before, if I'm honest. That night in Cedar Ridge, drunk as I was, I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Margaret stared at him, speechless. "Move into the house," he said again, gentler now. "Let me protect you properly. Let me be a real husband, if you'll have me." Before she could answer, shouts erupted from the yard. Luke ran for the door, Margaret close behind despite his orders to stay. What they saw made her gasp. The sky glowed orange again, but this time, it wasn't their buildings burning. "That's the Coleman place," old Pete said, pointing to the distant flames. "Looks like the whole ranch is going up." Luke stood frozen, calculating. "It's a trap. Has to be. Coleman burns his own place, blames us, brings the law down on our heads." "But we've all been here," Tom protested. "We have witnesses." "You think that matters to a bought judge?" Luke turned to Robert. "Saddle the horses. We ride for Fort Laramie tonight, all of us." "Luke, you can't," Margaret said. "If you run, you look guilty." "If we stay, we're sitting ducks when the marshal comes with Coleman's version of events." He gripped her shoulders. "I won't see you caught in the middle of this. We leave now. Get army protection. Tell our side first." The next hour was chaos. Margaret packed what she could while the men prepared for a hard ride. Luke fashioned a special saddle arrangement to keep her secure despite her pregnancy. "Can you manage it?" he asked as he helped her mount. "It's 30 miles to the fort." "I'm tougher than I look," she said, though fear gnawed at her. 30 miles through winter darkness, heavily pregnant, with potential pursuers behind them. It was madness, but staying might be worse. They rode through the frozen night, a desperate band fleeing accusation and violence. Margaret clung to the saddle horn, each jolt sending pain through her back. Luke stayed close, steadying her when the trail grew rough. Dawn was breaking when Luke suddenly held up his hand. halting the group. "Riders behind us! Moving fast!" Margaret's heart sank. They were still 10 miles from the fort. Exhausted, their horses blown. If Coleman's men caught them here. "Take Margaret and ride ahead," Luke ordered Robert. "Don't stop for anything." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I stay with you." "Margaret." "I stay with you," she repeated, meeting his eyes. "For better or worse, remember—" Luke's smile was grim but proud. "All right then, we make our stand together." The riders appeared over a rise, not Coleman's men, but a cavalry patrol from Fort Laramie. Relief flooded through Margaret so strongly she nearly fainted. "Lieutenant Morrison," Luke called out, recognizing the officer. "Are we glad to see you?" "Prescott, what are you doing out here?" The lieutenant's eyes widened as he took in Margaret's condition. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Coleman's ranch burned last night," Luke explained quickly. "We're riding to the fort before he can blame us for it." Morrison's expression darkened. "You haven't heard then. Samuel Coleman is dead, shot in his own home 2 days ago. Jake's been telling everyone you did it." The world seemed to stop. Margaret saw Luke's face go white. "2 days ago I was here, at the ranch. My men can vouch." "I believe you," Morrison said. "But Jake's got the territorial judge in his pocket. There's already a warrant. I'm sorry, Luke, but I have to take you in." "No," Margaret urged her horse forward. "Lieutenant, my husband is innocent. This is Coleman's revenge for Luke defending my honor." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure it will all get sorted out, ma'am, but I have my orders." Luke dismounted slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Take care of my wife, Morrison. Get her to the fort safely. She's close to her time." "Luke, don't do this," Margaret pleaded, but he was already handing over his gun. "I'll be fine," he said quietly, reaching up to touch her face. "Trust in the truth, Margaret. Take care of our child." As the soldiers bound Luke's hands, Margaret felt the first contraction hit sharp and sudden, stealing her breath. She gripped the saddle horn, determined not to show weakness now when Luke needed her strength. But as they began the final journey to Fort Laramie, Luke now a prisoner, their future uncertain, she couldn't suppress the fear that clutched her heart. They'd survived Coleman's harassment and nature's cruelty, only to face the corrupt justice of a lawless land. The baby moved within her, and Margaret straightened in the saddle. Whatever came next, she would face it. She was no longer the broken, barren woman who'd been locked in a stranger's room. She was Margaret Prescott, wife of Luke Prescott, and she would fight for her family with everything she had. The fort appeared in the distance, its walls promising safety but no guarantees of justice. As they rode through the gates, Margaret whispered a prayer for Luke, for their unborn child, and for the strength to weather this storm as they had all the others together. The storm hit Fort Laramie with the fury of a wounded beast, snow and sand mixing into a blinding wall that rattled windows and sent horses screaming in the stables. Margaret labored through it all, her body racked with contractions that came like waves crashing against cliffs. The fort's doctor, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Hartley, worked with steady hands despite the chaos outside. "Push, Mrs. Prescott," he urged, while his assistant, a sergeant's wife named Clara, wiped Margaret's forehead with cool cloths. "The baby's coming whether this storm likes it or not." Margaret gripped the iron bed frame, her knuckles white as another contraction seized her. Through the pain, she thought of Luke, locked in the fort's stockade awaiting transport to Cedar Ridge for trial. They hadn't let her see him since their arrival 2 days ago. "I can't," she gasped. "Not without Luke. He should be here." "That baby doesn't care about should or shouldn't. Doctor," Hartley said firmly. "Now, push." The storm howled, shutters banging against stone walls like drum beats. Margaret screamed, the sound lost in the wind's roar. And then suddenly, there was a different cry. Thin, angry, alive. "It's a boy," Clara announced, wrapping the infant quickly. "A healthy boy, born in the teeth of a Wyoming blizzard. He'll be tough. This one—" Margaret reached for her son with trembling arms, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the miracle she'd thought impossible. He was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair like his father's, and eyes that would surely be blue when they finally opened properly. "Luke has a son," she whispered, touching the baby's cheek with wonder. "After all those years of emptiness, a son." Dr. Hartley was still working, finishing his ministrations, when heavy boots sounded in the hallway. The door burst open, admitting Colonel William Brennan, the fort's commander, along with a snow-covered Lieutenant Morrison. "Mrs. Prescott," the colonel began, then stopped, taking in the scene. "I apologize for the intrusion. I didn't realize—" "My husband," Margaret interrupted, holding her son closer. "Colonel, please, let him see his child." Brennan's weathered face was sympathetic but firm. "I can't do that, ma'am. The territorial marshal arrives tomorrow to take custody. If I show favoritism—" "Then bring me to him," Margaret said fiercely. "I just gave birth to Luke Prescott's son in your fort. The least you can do is let his father see him." Clara and Dr. Hartley exchanged glances. "She shouldn't be moved," the doctor said. "Not in this storm. Not so soon after." "I'll walk if I have to." Margaret's voice carried the steel that months on the frontier had forged. "This child was born from a union everyone said was a joke. A mistake, but he's no mistake. Colonel, he's proof that sometimes grace comes from the darkest moments. His father will see him tonight." The colonel studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Morrison, get a wheelchair, and blankets, lots of blankets." He turned back to Margaret. 10 minutes, Mrs. Prescott. That's all I can give you." The journey through the fort's corridors was surreal. Wind shrieked through every crack, torches flickered wildly, and soldiers pressed against walls to let their strange procession pass the colonel leading. Margaret in the wheelchair holding her bundled son. Clara and Morrison flanking them like guards. The stockade was a grim stone building separate from the main fort. Inside, Luke sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, and his eyes went wide when he saw Margaret. "What are you doing here? You should be—" He stopped, noticing the bundle in her arms. "Is that—" "Your son," Margaret said softly. "Born an hour ago." The colonel himself unlocked the cell door. 10 minutes. Prescott. I'm bending every rule I have for this." Luke approached slowly, as if afraid he might shatter the moment. When Margaret placed the baby in his arms, she saw something break in his face, all the careful control, the stoic strength, crumbling before the reality of his child. "A son," he breathed, touching the tiny fingers that curled around his larger one. "Margaret, he's perfect." "He needs a name," she said, watching father and son meet for the first time. "I thought, William. Maybe, after my father." "William Prescott." Luke tested the name, then smiled the first real smile she'd seen since his arrest. Will Prescott. Strong name for a strong boy. The baby fussed, and Luke handed him back carefully. Then he knelt beside the wheelchair, taking Margaret's face in his hands. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "Robert has the papers for the ranch in the safe. If something happens—" "Nothing will happen," Margaret interrupted. "We'll fight this. Luke, Jake Coleman won't win. He has the judge, the marshal, probably half the jury already bought." Luke's jaw tightened. "But I need you to know something. These months with you, they've been the best of my life. I should have told you sooner. Should have—" "Time's up," Morrison said apologetically from the doorway. Luke kissed her then, fierce and desperate, pouring everything unsaid into that moment. Then he kissed his son's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of new life. "Take care of your mother, Will," he whispered. "Be the man I might not get the chance to help you become." They had to nearly drag Margaret away, her tears falling freely as the cell door clanged shut between them. Back in the infirmary, she collapsed into bed, clutching Will to her chest as the storm raged on. Clara stayed with her through the night, helping when the baby needed to nurse, offering silent comfort when Margaret's tears wouldn't stop. Dawn came gray and bitter, the storm finally exhausting itself, leaving drifts of snow mixed with sand piled against every building. "There's a lawyer in town," Clara said as she helped Margaret dress. "Marcus Thornton. He's not afraid of the Colemans. My husband says he's sent word already." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. Would he take Luke's case? He might if he hears the whole story. Clara fastened the last button. Sometimes justice needs a little help finding its way. The day passed in a blur. Margaret established herself in the visitors' quarters, tending to Will while receiving a steady stream of supporters. The fort's wives, initially standoffish, warmed to her when they heard her story. Lieutenant Morrison's wife organized meals. The chaplain's wife offered baby clothes her own children had outgrown. But it was the arrival of Marcus Thornton that afternoon that truly gave Margaret hope. The lawyer was younger than expected, with keen gray eyes and an air of quiet confidence. "Mrs. Prescott," he said after hearing the full tale. "Your husband's case is difficult but not hopeless. Samuel Coleman had many enemies. The trick will be proving Jake's motivation for false accusation. What do you need?" "Witnesses to your husband's whereabouts the night Coleman died. Documents showing the harassment you faced. And..." He hesitated. "It would help if we could find out who really killed Samuel Coleman." Margaret's mind raced. "There was a man who came to the boarding house in Cedar Ridge the night I met Luke. He stayed in his room, had meals delivered. I never saw his face." Thornton leaned forward. "When was this?" "The same night Jake locked me in Luke's room. The next morning, the man was gone, paid in advance, my mother said, and left before dawn." "Interesting." The lawyer made notes. "I'll send someone to investigate. Meanwhile, keep your spirits up. The marshal may have Jake's version, but truth has a way of surfacing." That evening, as Margaret nursed Will in the quiet of her room, she heard commotion outside. Peering through the window, she saw riders approaching not the marshal's party, but ranchers from the valley. She recognized several faces: Thomas Hartwell from the Box T, Eugene Masters from the Double Diamond, even old Wilhelm Schultz from the small spread near Cedar Ridge. They dismounted in the courtyard, their face grim with purpose. Colonel Brennan met them, and though Margaret couldn't hear the words, she saw gestures toward the stockade, papers being produced, heads nodding in agreement. Clara appeared at her door. "They've come to speak for your husband, Mr. Hartwell says Luke helped him fight off rustlers last spring. Mr. Masters says Luke gave him breeding stock on credit when drought killed half his herd. They're telling the colonel that Luke Prescott is no murderer." Margaret felt tears threaten again, but these were different tears of gratitude for the community Luke had built through quiet acts of kindness. Will stirred in her arms, making small sounds of contentment. Looking down at him, Margaret saw Luke's strength in the set of his tiny jaw, but something of herself too, the determination that had carried her through mockery and abandonment to this moment. "Your father is a good man," she whispered to her son, "and we're going to make sure the world knows it." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, covering the harsh landscape in pristine white. It reminded Margaret of grace, how it could fall on the righteous and unrighteous alike, offering everyone a chance at redemption. Tomorrow, the marshal would come. Tomorrow, Luke would face his accusers. But tonight, Margaret Prescott held her miracle child and dared to hope that justice, like grace, might find its way to them through the storm. The baby's fingers curled around hers, tiny but strong, holding on with instinctive trust. Margaret smiled through her tears. She had been the barren woman, the abandoned wife, the subject of cruel jokes. But now she was a mother, a fighter, a woman who had found love in the most unexpected place. "We'll bring him home. We'll," she promised. As stars began to appear in the clearing sky, "Your father will hold you again, not in a cell, but in freedom. This I swear on the miracle of your birth, we will be a family whole and unbroken." The fort settled into evening routines around them, but Margaret kept vigil, her son at her breast, her heart with the man in the stockade, her spirit unbroken despite the trials ahead. She had carried a child deemed impossible. She would carry this burden too, until Luke was free and their family complete. The night erupted in flames and gunfire just as Margaret finished settling Will into his makeshift cradle. The peaceful snow of earlier had given way to chaos, shouts of men, horses screaming, the acrid smell of smoke drifting through her window. She clutched her infant son to her chest as boots thundered down the hallway outside her quarters. "Mrs. Prescott." Clara burst through the door, her face white with terror. "Raiders are attacking the fort. They've set fire to the supply buildings." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Where's Luke?" "Still in the stockade. The colonel sent men to defend it, but—" Clara's words were cut short by an explosion that shook the walls. "We need to get you to the main building. It's safer there." Wrapping Will tightly, Margaret followed Clara into the corridor. Soldiers ran past them, some bleeding, all shouting orders or warnings. Through a window, she glimpsed masked riders circling the burning buildings, their torches arcing through the night like falling stars. "Coleman's men," she breathed. "They're trying to break Luke out and kill him in the confusion." They'd almost reached the main building when a figure stepped from the shadows, Jake Coleman himself, his face twisted with rage and madness, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Well, the whore and her bastard," he sneered. "Perfect. When they find your bodies, everyone will know Prescott killed you in jealous rage before escaping." Margaret pushed Clara behind her, shielding Will with her body. "You killed your own father, didn't you? That's why you're so desperate to blame Luke." Jake's laugh was hollow. The old fool was going soft, talking about making peace with Prescott, about how maybe I'd pushed too hard. His gun hand trembled. "He would have ruined everything, but with him gone and Prescott hanged for it, the whole valley belongs to me." "Not anymore," Margaret said quietly. In the distance, she could hear more gunfire, shouts of soldiers rallying. "Your raiders are failing. Jake, can't you hear it? The army doesn't run from outlaws." "Shut up!" Jake raised the pistol, but his attention wavered as Boots approached. In that instant, Margaret acted on instinct. She threw herself sideways, pushing Clara down as the gun fired. The bullet splintered wood where her head had been. Before Jake could fire again, Luke appeared like an avenging angel. He'd somehow gotten free, acquired a weapon, and now stood between his family and danger. The two men faced each other in the flickering light of distant fires. "Should have killed you properly," Jake snarled. "Your mistake," Luke replied coldly. They drew simultaneously. 2 shots echoed in the narrow hallway. Jake's went wide, his nerve failing at the crucial moment. Luke's found its mark. Jake Coleman crumpled to the floor, his reign of terror ending in a spreading pool of blood. Luke immediately turned to Margaret, his hands checking her and Will for injuries. "Are you hurt, the baby?" "We're fine," Margaret gasped, still processing what had happened. "How did you get free?" "Robert and the boys. When the attack started, they overpowered the guards at the stockade." He pulled her close, Will safe between them. "I heard the shot. I thought—" His voice broke. Colonel Brennan arrived with a squad of soldiers, taking in the scene grimly. "Coleman." "Dead," Luke confirmed. "He confessed to killing his father, Mrs. Prescott and Mrs. Hayes heard it all. Clara nodded vigorously. Every word. Colonel, he said his father was going soft. Wanted to make peace. The colonel holstered his weapon. Well, that simplifies things considerably. Morrison, get the doctor for these women, and someone clean up this mess. As soldiers carried Jake's body away, Margaret noticed a folded paper that had fallen from his coat. She picked it up. Recognizing her mother's boarding house letterhead, her hands shook as she read. J. The job is done. S. Coleman won't trouble you anymore. Leave my payment at the usual place. M. R. Luke, she whispered, showing him the note. M. R. The mysterious guest at the boarding house. Jake hired someone to kill his own father. Luke took the paper, his expression grim. This proves everything. Jake orchestrated it all, his father's murder, framing me, tonight's attack. He handed it to Colonel Brennan. I believe you'll want this for your report. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The raiders, leaderless with Jake's death, were quickly subdued. The fires were controlled with minimal damage. By dawn, order had been restored to Fort Laramie, though smoke still hung in the cold air. Margaret sat in the colonel's office, Will sleeping peacefully despite the night's chaos, as she gave her formal statement. Luke stood behind her chair, his hand reassuring on her shoulder. Mrs. Prescott, Colonel Brennan said when she finished. Your courage last night saved lives, facing down an armed man to protect others. He shook his head. You have my deepest respect. I had something worth protecting, Margaret replied simply, looking down at Will. Marcus Thornton arrived as they were finishing, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of a hasty ride. I've heard the news. Jake Coleman is dead. By my hand, Luke confirmed, in defense of my wife and child. And we have written evidence of his conspiracy, the colonel added, showing the lawyer the incriminating note. Thornton's smile was sharp with satisfaction. Then I believe we can consider all charges against Mr. Prescott dropped. In fact, with Jake dead and no other heirs, there's the question of the Coleman Ranch holding. Let it rot, Luke said flatly. I want nothing of his... Actually, Margaret interjected quietly, maybe we should consider it, not for us, but for the families Jake drove off their lands. The Hendersons, the Pauleys, others who lost everything to Coleman greed. The land could be divided, given back to those who deserve it. Luke looked at her with something like wonder. You do that after everything. Grace comes in many forms, she said. Sometimes it's a child born from sorrow. Sometimes it's justice finally served. And sometimes it's the chance to heal old wounds. The lawyer nodded approvingly. I can draw up the papers. It will take time, but it can be done. As they prepared to leave Fort Laramie, the entire population seemed to turn out. Soldiers saluted Luke, their wives embraced Margaret, and everyone wanted to peek at young Will, already being called the Blizzard Baby for his dramatic arrival. You'll always have friends here. Colonel Brennan told them, anytime you need help, you send word. The journey back to the Triple Bar was vastly different from their desperate flight days earlier. The sun shone bright on fresh snow, and their escort included not just their own ranch hands, but volunteers from neighboring spreads. The story had spread quickly, how Margaret had faced down Jake Coleman, how Luke had saved his family, how justice had finally caught up with corruption. As they crested the final ridge, the ranch spread before them in the morning light. The burned barn was an ugly scar, but the house stood strong, smoke rising from the chimney in welcome. Home, Margaret breathed. Home, Luke agreed, his arm around her as she held Will. Though it almost cost us everything. No, Margaret corrected gently. It gave us everything, each other, our son, a future free from shadows. She looked up at him. I love you. Luke Prescott. I should have said it sooner, but I was afraid. He silenced her with a kiss, gentle and sure. "I love you too, Margaret. Have since you stood up to me that first morning, chin high despite everything." Will chose that moment to wake, announcing his hunger with healthy lungs. They laughed, the sound carrying across the snow to where their friends and workers waited to welcome them home. As they descended toward the ranch, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. A cruel joke had locked her in a room with a stranger. That joke had led to a child everyone said was impossible, a marriage born of necessity that had grown into love, and trials that had forged them into something stronger than either could have been alone. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That Jake Coleman's joke became our miracle," she said. "He meant to humiliate me, to destroy any chance I had at happiness. Instead, he gave me you, gave us Will, gave us this life." Luke's hand covered hers on the reins. "Then we owe him thanks, in a twisted way." "No," Margaret said firmly. "We owe thanks to something higher than Jake Coleman's cruelty, to whatever power turns darkness into light, sorrow into joy, barrenness into abundance." As they rode into the ranch yard, Robert Hayes called out, "Welcome home, Boss Mrs. Prescott." The other hands took up the cry, and suddenly the air was full of celebration. Margaret looked at her husband, their son, their people, their land. The woman who had been labeled barren and worthless had returned carrying not just a child, but hope for an entire community. The joke meant to destroy had instead created, and in that transformation, she found the greatest truth of all that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, strong enough to withstand any storm the Wyoming sky could send. "Welcome home indeed," she murmured, as Luke helped her down from the wagon, Will safe in her arms. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, a family forged in fire, tested by trials and proven stronger than all the forces that had tried to break them. The sun climbed higher, blessing the Triple Bar Ranch with light and warmth, as if heaven itself approved of the love that had grown from such an unlikely beginning. The spring of 1875 arrived like a benediction over the Triple Bar Ranch, painting the prairie in shades of green and gold. Margaret stood on the porch of their newly expanded house, watching Luke teach young Will to walk. The boy, now just over a year old, toddled between his father's outstretched arms with determination that brought tears to her eyes. "That's it, son," Luke encouraged, his face alight with pride. "Come to Papa." Will gurgled with delight as he made it safely to his father's embrace, and Margaret's heart swelled. The bitter woman who had fled Cedar Ridge in shame could never have imagined this scene: a loving husband, a healthy child, a thriving ranch, and, most remarkably, her mother Ruth approaching on the wagon road for her first visit. "Mama's coming?" Margaret called to Luke, shading her eyes against the morning sun. They had corresponded regularly since Will's birth, but this would be Ruth's first time seeing her grandson. As the wagon drew closer, Margaret noticed it wasn't just her mother. The entire bed was loaded with supplies, and beside Ruth sat Reverend Douglas and, surprisingly, Dr. Morrison from Cedar Ridge. Ruth climbed down with surprising agility for her years, her eyes immediately finding Will in Luke's arms. "Oh, Margaret," she breathed, tears starting. "He's perfect." "Mama?" Margaret embraced her mother, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and fresh bread. "I'm so glad you've come." Dr. Morrison approached hesitantly, hat in hand. "Mrs. Prescott, I hope you don't mind my intrusion. I needed to see for myself." "See what, Doctor?" Margaret asked, though she knew. The old physician's eyes were fixed on Will, who regarded the strangers with the Luke's steady blue gaze. "A miracle," he said quietly. "In 30 years of practice, I've never been more wrong about anything. I told you that you couldn't bear children." "You told me what you believed to be true," Margaret said gently. "We all did our best with what we knew." Dr. Morrison shook his head. "I labeled you barren, That label nearly destroyed your life, and yet here stands proof that sometimes medical certainty must yield to divine possibility. Reverend Douglas stepped forward. Which brings us to why we've come. Besides your mother's visit, the town has been reflecting on how you were treated. Many feel shame for their part in your suffering. Luke shifted Will to one arm, his free hand finding Margaret's. Cedar Ridge's opinions matter little to us now, Reverend. Perhaps. The minister agreed. But justice and reconciliation matter to God. The town has taken up a collection. He produced a leather pouch, heavy with coin. For the child. And there's more. The old Coleman Ranch has been legally divided as you requested. The Hendersons, the Pauleys, and 3 other families have returned to their lands. They send their gratitude. Margaret felt Luke tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand gently. We're grateful for the gesture. Reverend, the money will go toward building a school. This valley needs one, and Will should have the chance to learn alongside other children. Ruth beamed at her daughter. Still thinking of others first, some things never change. They spent the afternoon on the porch, Ruth holding her grandson while regaling them with news from Cedar Ridge. The boarding house thrived under new management. Jake Coleman's former friends had scattered to the winds, and most surprisingly, James Sullivan had left the territory entirely after his new wife abandoned him. Seems she couldn't bear his moods any more than you could, Ruth said with satisfaction. Though she lacked your grace in leaving, took everything valuable he owned. Margaret felt only a distant pity for the man who had once broken her heart. That life seemed to belong to someone else entirely. As the sun began its descent, Dr. Morrison asked if he might speak with Margaret privately. They walked to the small garden she'd planted, where early vegetables pushed through the soil. I've thought often about that night, the doctor began awkwardly. The night you were locked in Mr. Prescott's room. I was in town, drinking at the saloon. I saw Jake and his friends laughing about what they'd done. Margaret stopped walking. You knew. I suspected, but I said nothing. Did nothing. His aged face crumpled with shame. I told myself it wasn't my business, that you were already ruined. I was a coward. Doctor. Please, let me finish. When I heard you were with child, I assumed the worst, that perhaps Jake had been right about your character. It wasn't until news came of Jake's death and his confession that I understood the full truth. You were innocent in all ways, and yet you bore the punishment while men like me stayed silent. Margaret studied the old man's bowed head, seeing the weight he'd carried. I forgive you, Dr. Morrison. We all failed each other in some way, but look what came from that failure. She gestured toward the house where Will's laughter carried on the wind. Would I change anything if it meant losing him, losing Luke? No. The doctor raised wondering eyes. You truly forgive so easily. Not easily, Margaret admitted, but truly. Bitterness is a poison that hurts only the one who drinks it. I choose joy instead. That evening, they held a feast in the main house. The ranch hands joined them, along with Robert and Mary Hayes and their children. The table groaned under the weight of food, and laughter filled rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. As Margaret served dessert, her famous apple pie that had become a ranch legend, she caught Luke watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her blush like a new bride. What? She asked softly. Just thinking, he replied, about that night in Cedar Ridge. How angry I was to wake up and find you there. How we both tried so hard to maintain propriety and distance. And now, she glanced meaningfully at Will, who was cheerfully smearing mashed potatoes into his hair despite Ruth's gentle attempts to stop him. Now I thank God for Jake Coleman's cruelty. Luke said simply, because it brought me you. After the guests had retired, Margaret and Luke sat on their porch, Will finally asleep in his cradle between them. The stars wheeled overhead in the vast Wyoming sky, and somewhere in the distance, A coyote sang to the moon. "Your mother asked if we planned more children," Luke said suddenly. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her stomach. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell him, but perhaps there was no better time than now, under the benevolent stars. "What did you tell her?" "That it was in God's hands." He paused. "Though I wouldn't mind a daughter. Someone as strong and brave as her mother." "Then you should be pleased," Margaret said quietly, "because I believe God has already placed that gift in his hands. I'm with child again. Luke, I've known for certain since last week." Luke's whoop of joy woke Will, who immediately joined in with delighted babbling, and soon the whole house was awake and celebrating. As Margaret accepted congratulations from their makeshift family, she marveled at the fullness of her life. The barren woman had become fruitful. The cast-off wife had found true love. The subject of cruel jokes had become the respected mistress of a thriving ranch. Each transformation had required pain, had demanded courage, had tested faith. But oh, the glory of the harvest after such bitter planting. Later, as the house settled back into sleep, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, Luke's arms around her from behind, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach where new life grew. "No more miracles," she murmured. "I don't think my heart can hold any more joy." "Don't be so sure," Luke replied, kissing her temple. "If I've learned anything from you, it's that miracles come disguised as disasters. Who knows what wonders tomorrow might bring?" Margaret leaned back into his warmth, watching the stars, thinking of all the women who might be lying awake tonight, weeping over empty wombs or broken marriages or cruel gossip. If she could speak to them, she would say, "Hold on, joy comes in the morning. Sometimes it takes a detour through sorrow. Sometimes it arrives wearing the mask of scandal. But joy will come to those who dare to hope." "The infertile bride returned carrying his child," she whispered, echoing the words that had once been her shame but were now her glory. "And then she carried another, and built a life so full of love it spilled over onto everyone around her." "Amen," Luke said softly. "Now come to bed, Mrs. Prescott. Tomorrow we start building that school, and I have a feeling you'll insist on helping despite your condition." Margaret smiled, taking one last look at the prairie that had become her home. In the distance, lightning flickered behind the mountains, promising rain for the thirsty land. Tomorrow there would be work and challenges, joys and sorrows, the endless rhythm of ranch life. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The joke had become a blessing, the curse had become a gift, and Margaret Sullivan Prescott, once the most pitied woman in Cedar Ridge, had become living proof that sometimes the best stories begin with the worst chapters. As she turned from the window to follow her husband to bed, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever power had orchestrated this impossible happy ending. And somewhere in the vast Wyoming night, it seemed the very stars themselves whispered back, "This is just the beginning." Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Luke's journey. Your comments inspire more stories from the American frontier.